that don't have the story of the Jesus drawing in the dirt and saying cast the first stone. Without saying cast the first stone.
That's a great question. So the story, what do I do with the story of Jesus drawing in the sand, and if you're without sand cast? That's actually not in Mark. It's in John 7:53 through 8:11. And what's interesting about that, there's several things interesting about the story. It is not in the most ancient manuscripts of John that we have, and the story's in other Gospels and some of the manuscripts. It shows up in Luke a couple places and other places in John. The fact that it ends up in John in that spot and became the dominant way to keep it, it was a floating story. Basically, it was a floating story. And so we know the story is old because it appears in some very old manuscripts in different Gospels. So either it was originally part of a Gospel early on and got moved around and it floated up in the air and then landed again, or B, it never was in a Gospel. It was genuinely an independent oral story of Jesus. Or C, it's make-believe, it's fiction, maybe based on something kind of happened to him, like it, or just a story made up. These are all real options. They're all possible options. And then New Testament scholars will typically not... They typically don't... They, at minimum, they all concur it shouldn't be in John. In that spot, it shouldn't be in that spot. Correct. So they all concur, and I agree with them. There's no reason at all to think John 7:53 through 8:11 was original to John's Gospel. If you see how and by original, I mean the first major version of John's Gospel. Mm-hmm. And one of the main reasons why I think that, not only does the manuscript tradition demonstrate most ancient doesn't have it there in John, but the second reason is if you excise the story and read through John 7:52 to John 8:12, it flows perfectly. It looks like a big fat speed, but I'm like, well, what happened? I mean, it's... so I don't think it was original to John. Then the issue is it an original story of Jesus that traveled around? It is likely that's the case. And I argue, and many people do, for multiple reasons. One is it seems to fit Jesus's theological emphases of having mercy and so forth, and we can have a list of those kinds of things. The vocabulary kind of fits him. But I'm just not sure. For a long time, in fact, I was just thinking about that story the other day. A lot of times commentators won't even comment on it in John 7:53. They will just skip over and say this is not the earliest manuscripts. And they just keep on going.
Yeah, that's all I'd ever heard, that it wasn't in the earliest. I never heard that, but it was in earlier other Gospels, right?
Well, not earlier, but it shows up in other manuscripts in Luke's Gospel. Right.
Okay.
So the earliest manuscripts we have of Luke and John and all the Gospels, they're not there.
Yeah, okay, so it's not.
They eventually get there around the 4th, 5th century.
Okay.
And it doesn't mean it was never there earlier. Again, that's why it's always very clear to make sure when scholars make the nuance, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It means we don't have evidence that it was there.
We don't have the
Correct. We don't have the first century document. Correct. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So is it possible that story was in a gospel and somehow got damaged until it made to the next? That's always possible. Yeah. But there are sayings of Jesus that are not in the gospel. They're called agraphon, which literally in Greek means something like not written. And they appear a couple times in the New Testament itself. And one of the most well-known ones is in the book of Acts, where Paul tells people, he says, as our Lord said, you are more blessed to give than to receive. Jesus never says that in the Gospels.
There's never any.
Yeah.
That quote's never in the Gospel.
So again, it's the same thing. Is that something he could have said? Sure sounds like it. Either he just made it up, which is unlikely.
Right.
He received that oral tradition from someone who made it up, which is possible but not real likely. Or it's a genuine saying of Jesus that just didn't make it to the Gospels. And most scholars concur there probably were numerous kinds of sayings and parables that simply just were never written down. So it's not crazy to think the woman caught in adultery story is...
It very well
could have happened. Yeah, it could have happened. I was going to say a second ago, where commentators typically don't comment on it, I've never preached on it. I've never preached on it my entire life on purpose because I thought it's not in John's Gospel. It's not original.
Yeah.
But having said that, just the other day I was thinking about this, and I thought, it doesn't matter the context. I was thinking about Scripture being authoritative, and I was thinking, at minimum, it made it into the Gospel eventually. And the church, a big chunk of the church for almost 2,000 years has concurred. It's part of our canon. It's part of our Bible. Mm-hmm. And on that sense alone, one could make the argument, well, then it's worth preaching on. But I myself am such driven by historian issue, the historical issues that I want to say, I'm just not sure. I like being able to say, and then Jesus said, or at least Mark said Jesus said. And I can say it about John's gospel. I can say John's, but I'll say, well, at some point, someone put in John's gospel. You see, it becomes this dumb nuance, and that's my nerd problem. So it's there. It's an interesting story.
It doesn't change the meaning of the whole point of the gospel either.
It doesn't to me, and most people agree with you that it doesn't change anything. There's no theology. There is no theological view or tenet of the Christian faith that is changed by any of them. Yeah. Bart Ehrman wants to make a big deal about a few. There's about a dozen that almost every scholar, and that's really only about a dozen. And of those dozen, there's about 5 or 6 that are a little bit more bigger deal. And Bart Ehrman wants to make almost all dozen really big deals, and one is that one. But, I mean, it really comes down to a handful that goes, oh, that's interesting, like Mark 1:41, where it says Jesus had compassion on the man with the withered hand, or he had anger or rage. Orgisthai is a different Greek word. So the more ancient manuscript said he felt very angry. And it probably was anger, because most New Testament critics say the more difficult reading is probably more likely, that it's more likely they got softened over time.
Yeah.
And I find that pretty convincing, and not all the time, but pretty convincing. But Bart make a big deal of that. Well, I don't at all. In fact, I mentioned that when we did Mark chapter 1, because I think Mark did say Jesus was angry, not at the man with their hand, but the ones who looked on skeptical. He's mad because the enemies of Jesus, he's mad about that. And then you have the story, the one Bart loves to talk about is in Hebrews. There's one Greek word called kodos, and kodos you can change it. It's a small spelling. And in Greek it means without. And so did Jesus die without God or apart from God? And they make different. And he said, this changes the entire meaning of the entire book. No, I absolutely disagree. No, it does not. It changes the meaning of a verse. But that's all. So all that to say, the fanfare of there's so many variants and that they don't fit. There are. Mark 1:1, and I said, I don't know if I covered this. I probably did. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Son of God doesn't show up in some of the ancient manuscripts. I did a whole paper, my PhD, on that verse. I think I said this in the study. I remember in class, I finished the whole paper, and I said, end of it doesn't matter at all. And they all laughed, and the professor said, when I read that, I went, then why'd you do the paper? And they all laughed, and I said, it doesn't matter. He's called a Son of God many other times in the gospel. It doesn't change a lick. If it doesn't appear in 1:1, chapter 1, verse 1, what difference does it make? It is a variant. Yep. We're not exactly sure if Son of God should be there or not. That's true. But interpretively, theologically, it makes zero difference. And in my opinion, none of the variants make any difference at all. And that's a big deal. I say this when I talk to people about Christianity. It's staggering how much we do know about what they said. And when you look at the ancient manuscripts, you don't have major lacunae. These are major gaps, literal holes in the manuscripts. Like the Dead Sea Scrolls, if there's a copy, we have tons of copies of things they talked about just because they're within the community. They're not Bible verses. They're just a manual on how to do baptism, a manual on how you should be righteous, a manual on whatever. And there's big holes in them because they're 2,000 years old. We will never know what they said ever they won't happen. Because only that community produced it, whatever. And so when we do the translations, and there's several English translations, good ones, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they just put bracket and they put ... We don't have a clue. Now, if they have a clue within a word like son of and it's ... D, they'll put Son of God. They think that's what it may mean. Right. But none of that is in the New Testament. And let's think about it. We don't have 1 0 lacunae. There's no gap at anywhere in the entire. What we have are additions. So if the only thing comes close maybe is the ending of Mark's Gospel, Mark 16:9, where it says, and they left and told no one because they were afraid. And the early church didn't like that. They started adding longer endings to it. And so then the debate is, was that the original ending or was the original ending lost? But whatever it was, the early scribes didn't like them. They wanted it to jive more like Matthew and Luke. So they have this longer story of, then he went and told the disciples and they were happy or whatever. And then you got to be baptized. No, it's good. Good question. Good stuff. We did pretty quickly end on Mark chapter 10 last time, and I just want to go back very quickly to that to set the stage. The end of Mark chapter 10, on a narrative level, really does end a long section. And if you'll remember, we talked about how Jesus gives 3 passion predictions, Mark 8:31, 9:31, and 10:33-35. And he says, I'm going to be handed over, beaten up, killed, and I will rise again. The disciples, in essence, don't get it. He has a teaching block of material to try to explain some stuff, and then he says the prediction again. It happens over and over and over. What we call chapter 11, things really change, because chapter 11 through 13 basically is Jesus around the temple. And it's different then. Now he's around opponents. People don't like him. He's not doing a whole lot of discipleship training, you might say. He's not calling people to be his disciple. And so things really change at the end of what we call chapter 10. And so just briefly, not to cover all of it, just to remind it, chapter 10, verse 46, we have this classic story of blind Bartimaeus. Now he's coming, Bartimaeus, Bar in Aramaic means son, Timaeus, like the honorable son. So he's known just by his daddy. He doesn't have a name. He's Timmy's son. That's really all that means. But he's a blind beggar. Of course he's a beggar because he's blind. And he was sitting by the roadside. Notice in your translation, verse 46, it says son of Timaeus. Now it says that because, of course, Mark's audience doesn't know Aramaic. And these are the telltale signs. If you go way back to the introduction on Mark's Gospel where I started the study, I talked about how there are different signs that Mark's audience was not a predominantly Jewish, Aramaic-speaking Palestinian group, or Israeli Jewish group. And these are the kinds of signs, because he always has to translate the Aramaic. If he says, Taluth kum, which means, little girl, I say rise. Or if he says, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, a little bit, he'll say, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? They don't know Aramaic. This is a Greek-speaking congregation, no doubt about it. But these kind of Aramaisms, these throwback, where he keeps it on virtually every historian says, surely these are original nuggets of the actual words of Jesus. Because that's what he spoke, was Aramaic. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Or Matthew makes it Hebrew. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. But it's Aramaic, and they're cousin languages. Or Telem Hakum, or on, these kind of things here. And so, son of Timaeus, he has to explain it, Bartimaeus. They heard it, he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, which of course Jesus is one of it's a sobriquet. He began to cry out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. And I want to remind us, because make sure we keep seeing the big picture here. The number one topic of Jesus, remember all the way back to Mark chapter 1, verse 14 to 15, is that, particularly verse 15, is that the kingdom of God has come upon them. God's reign, God's rule has come upon him. It's so important for us as Christians to keep remembering, even if you're not a Christian, if you want to understand the Gospels correctly, you need to understand, as I said a billion times, the number one chief topic of Jesus is the kingdom of God. Jesus he believed, back then, I'm sure he still does, but he believed in his ministry, clearly, that he thought he was ushering in God's kingdom. When you saw him, God's rule came with him. This is probably not very, not Christian, reverent, but, I don't give a rep. One of my favorite movies, I'm sure Jesus too, is Tombstone. Oh my goodness. And there's a great, great twist to this, Kurt Russell, right? Yep. It is Kurt. They think they're losing. They're going, you said, all right, you win. And he goes, wow, man, it smelled like someone's dead. You didn't want to now. Anyway, they go to the train station. All of a sudden, the guys go kill him. They go take him out, finish the job. Well, the guy knocks him out. Kurt Russell shoots a guy, another guy. He puts the gun on his face. And he's, don't kill me. He says, you go tell so-and-so I'm coming. You tell him coming, and what? And hell's coming with me. Hell's coming with me. And the music builds up. And I thought, and he does. The rest of the movie, it's wrath. I mean, it's just horrible wrath. On the opposite side, kind of, sort of, to me, that's always epitomized, quite frankly, when Jesus says, the kingdom of God has come. When you see me, you see the kingdom of God has come with me. When you see me, I'm not just a buddy. I'm not just a dude. And it's important. I'm a prophet, and I speak on behalf of God the Father, but I'm not just a prophet. John the Baptizer was just a prophet. Jesus pointed toward and instantiated. He did both. The kingdom of God is upon you. This is what it looks like. There's more to come, but now that you see me here, it has come upon you. His parable spoke about it, his actions when he cast out demons, when he heals the sick. These are all signs that God's rule has come upon him. And I think about the analogy of the book I'm writing right now. I'm using it. Imagine the State of the Union at the time of this podcast. The State of the Union just occurred, and I was thinking, what if there were several tribes of Native Americans that for centuries had this dream, this prophetic dream that the great eagle told them a great native warrior would rise and would unite the tribes and they'd be free. And every once in a while, a leader would come up and they would call that person the Messiah, who would unite the tribes and they would free the domination of the American rule. And that's what happened. And imagine at the State of the Union, the leader bursts in, he comes into town. He comes into town and he says, and everybody starts saying, he's the president, he's the president. No one could miss how politically charged that is, if that makes sense. No one could miss the illusions that they think that guy is the leader. And when he comes here, the tribes of the nations are all uniting behind this guy. That's in a nutshell very much like, not exactly like, but very much like when the Jews that did believe in the Messiah, a Messiah, not everyone did, the ones that did believed it like that. The tribes of Israel would be reconstituted. Jerusalem would be the capital of the world. They would kick out all the Romans. The king would be established. I mean, it says it specifically in Zechariah. The idea is that God would come back to his kingdom. So when he says son of David, we can't miss his constant allusions to the fact that they really did believe, those that believed in Jesus. He is this kingly figure, this royal figure who's going to do what they hope he was going to do. And he's headed to Jerusalem. Surely he's going to go and be elected president. By God, it'll be proven. And that's what happens. But in the narrative we've learned, the disciples don't always see it. Remember that? So when Jesus says in Mark chapter 8, I'll be going to hand it over and whatever, Peter pulls him aside and rebukes him. He says, shut up, Jesus. You're talking nonsense. They're not ready for that king the same way. Earlier, just a little while ago in this narrative, it's the disciples going to say, hey, do what we want for you. And Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? We want to see your left and right hand come to power. They should be one like a child. He just taught them on a couple occasions. Instead, they're still vying for a power. So the disciples are obtuse, probably because Jesus it's quite frankly difficult to always grasp. But here's this blind beggar. That's what this is thick with irony. Mark loves the irony. The blind guy perceives of Jesus clearly. He's the son of David. He's a royal figure. And he cries out, of course, have mercy on me. Not let me be in a place of power, but have mercy to me. And Jesus says this. Now, of course, they tell him, shut up, be quiet. And he cries even more. I love that. I love it. Oh, man. That's one of those texts that's just easy to preach. When someone tells you to be quiet, shut up, and evil people, you keep on shouting. I mean, you don't give up. And Jesus stopped and said, of course, called him. And this description is almost unnecessary. He could just say the guy comes to Jesus, but it's so vivid. He tells the blind man, take heart, rise, or you might say, be of good courage, rise. He's calling you. He's calling you. Hey, be good job, man. Go get him. Now, he throws off the cloak. This guy's poor. That's all a cloak and they slept on the ground. They had usually just 2 layers, if that much. This you can see almost a slow motion in a movie. He runs to Jesus, and notice what Jesus says, almost verbatim, word for word, what he said to the disciples when they said, Jesus, do whatever we want for you. Jesus asked blind Bartimaeus, what do you want for me to do? And he says what he should be asking, what the disciples should be asking, which is, help me see. The disciples should be asking the same question. Of course, metaphorically, theologically, that's what they should have been asking. Help me see clearly who you are and so forth. But this blind beggar gets it right. And because he gets it right, and he wants to mercy, not places of power, Jesus says, go, your faith has made you well. And he followed him on the way. It's the only person in the narrative who actually follows Jesus as a disciple after being healed. Now, earlier in the narrative, one was healed who wanted to follow Jesus, and he said, no, don't do it. But this one, he follows him en theodo in Greek, on the way. And that's a metaphor. On the way means like that discipleship journey on the way to Jerusalem. Now, remember, just to beat that drum again, Jesus has been saying, I'm going here to deliberately, I'm telling you, be killed. But what he does around it still keeps evincing their hopes that it's not going to be just like that Jesus is talking crazy. Does that make sense so far? I want to pause there. Any questions? So it wraps that section up. So we hope the disciples get to see clearly who he is, and they kind of do and kind of don't. We move. Okay. What we call chapter 11. And when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage, so Bethphage, and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, that's from the east, and that matters because to come from the east, there were certain Jewish expectations that the Messiah would actually come from the east. So there are different telltale signs in this thing that if you're a typical Jew, there's probably the signs that you say, this guy's royalty. So he comes to the Mount of Olives. He sent 2 of his disciples, and he said to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you'll find a colt, a fowl maybe, a tied on which no one has ever sat untied, and bring it. Let me pause here for a second. The reason why they're going to Bethany is right outside the city limits of Jerusalem. Now, this is what's called Pesach, or Passover. Passover is a week long. It always occurred on the 14th of Nisan. Jews follow a calendar by the moon, so it's a lunar calendar. Ours is a solar calendar because of the Romans. And so the lunar calendar changes on the solar calendar. It changes those days. But for them, it's always Nisan 14th. But for us, it's a floating day because the lunar calendar is shorter than the solar calendar. And so because of that, we can always link exactly when this kind of stuff happened. We know Jesus died on that Friday, which is, depending on what year it is, probably AD 30, April 14th, AD 30. If it is the case, this is probably Sunday, April 2nd, AD 30, on the Roman Gregorian, later on Gregorian calendar. But they stayed in, okay, so that happened. When you go into Jerusalem, several studies demonstrate, for all kinds of reasons, that the town would have flooded close to 10 times the normal population. We should expect several 100,000 people, maybe 500,000 people flood into Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. You don't have to stay in Jerusalem. First off, there weren't enough room for it. So imagine, just like now, I'd like to think of Super Bowl. It wasn't that populated, but by comparison it is. If you go to the Super Bowl, you can't always stay in a hotel across the street. You stay in hotels nearby. They did the same thing. They would stay in regions and hotels and houses and family friends just outside the city gates. You had to eat Passover within the city limits, but you didn't stay there the whole time. And it was a long festival, and I'll talk a lot more about that. It's the holy city. That's right. It's required to eat the Pesach there if you can get there. If you can get there. Not everyone could. Some people lived over in Persia and what they call Babylon. Some people in Rome, they couldn't always make it. But if you could, you wanted to get in Jerusalem. That was the custom. So they get into Bethany because that's kind of like a safe home, a safe haven. But they're going to go in Jerusalem during the day to do their business and then come back probably each night is probably what happened. So he tells them, go in the village and you're going to find it. You're going to find a donkey. Matthew's version adds 2 donkeys. And I've already done a whole study on Matthew. You can listen to my podcast, whatever. I don't really care. But the point is, untie it and say this. And there's different ways you could say the Lord has need of it. We'll send it back here immediately. The master will send it. If you read it, the Lord, which you can. I mean, the Greek word, Lord, can Lord or master or owner if you want. If you read into it, a lot of people, Christians do, they say Jesus means the Lord, like it's God Almighty. Maybe. I don't think that. Probably safe to say most interpreters don't, but whatever. I don't think that. I think it's a way of saying either a teacher or ruler has need of it, let him have it, and therefore just literally out of deference to a Jewish teacher, he would let him have it. Or B, Jesus knows the guy, and he's just arranged this already. Before we think that's too crazy that he arranged it already, a lot of people forget Jesus was not around the disciples every second all the time. He just wasn't. For example, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, remember, Jesus' ministry is almost entirely around Galilee and Capernaum. In John's Gospel, Jesus' ministry is almost entirely in Judea. Remember, it's in John's Gospel only that mentions Lazarus. Mary and Martha sure assume Lazarus is almost like a best friend. He's never mentioned in the Synoptic Gospels. That's probably because most of it comes from the area of Galilee and the oral tradition surrounding. So there's all kinds of time Jesus would have come into town teaching and got the disciples, but what were they doing while he was gone? Probably preaching and teaching. Maybe about to see what the wife was doing, the kids. The point is he's around town. Now, this is Jerusalem, so this is in Judea. And in John's Gospel, he's been here at least 2 different times. So all that to say, make up your own mind, the historical situation. My own view is that probably he had made arrangements. He tells the guy, hey, the owner of this needs to come into town. Jesus probably arranged it. If you want to read this as some deep supernatural thing, like the Lord, he's a prophet, you can. I just, whatever. But what matters to me, it might matter to you a whole lot. You might want to jive together Matthew's version of 2 donkeys and say, Mark just forgot to mention 1 and all that. Fine. I don't really give a rip. What I care about is what Mark and Matthew and Luke try to evince, and that is clearly Zechariah 9:9. That Zechariah 9:9 is what would be considered a messianic prophecy amongst Jews eventually, and that is the king would come in on a donkey, not as a stallion, which anybody would have understood. Jews, Greeks, I said Jukes. That's a short way to say. Jews, Greeks, and Romans would have understood a big white stallion as a victorious processional, that the person comes into town as a conquering hero king. Zechariah says, no, he's going to come in on a lowly, humble donkey. That is the point. Jesus, he's doing this on purpose to be symbolic, not because he's tired. There's no way that's the case. Go find that colt. I'm going to ride on them. So they go and do it. They find the colt tied at the door in the open street, and they untied it. Open street probably, we know the time period, houses could oftentimes open up in two streets or open up to courtyards. So the point, it's just not like today where everything's bolted down. It's not the same. But anyway, they find it, they untie it. The assumption is probably they tell the guy, hey, this is the guy with the donkey. And those who stood there said, well, hey, what are you doing? Untying the colt. They told him that Jesus said. They let him go. Who the they is, again, we don't know. We probably have to assume whoever the owner was. And they brought the colt to Jesus, and he threw their garments on it, and he sat upon it. It's a saddle, is what it is. And many spread their garments on the road. And others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields. Now, in John's Gospel, and only John's Gospel, it says these were palm branches, but synoptics leave that out. But whatever it is, they go and do that, and they're putting garments on the road like a red carpet, but they're not putting the leaves. You could put leaves on the ground if you wanted, sure, but probably what's the idea that happened, and John's Gospel brings out a little better, is that they're waving the branches. They're waving them. Why in the world are they doing that? It is a sign, based on 2 Kings 9:13, it's a sign of royalty coming into town. What's really important to remember here, and it's not in your Bible, it's not in your Bible because I know you're Protestants, but, well, it's in that Bible because you're using mine. It's something that happened, what's called the Maccabean Revolt. And a quick review of this, and really quick. There was a guy named, his nickname was the Maccabean, Judas Maccabeus, which is something like Judas the Hammer was his nickname. When the Syrian kings came in and Antiochus IV came into town, he set up puppet priests. And he did something really, really bad. He did several things bad. But one was he went to the temple, sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies. And they call that the sacrilege, the desolating sacrilege. That is the worst conceivable thing, basically, you could do. That's what he did. Well, after he did that and set up these little puppet priests everywhere, Judas the Hammer and some people, when they were forced to do sacrifices out in the country in a different way, he killed the priest on the altar in which he was forced to do it, and then started a guerrilla warfare movement, which would become the Maccabean Revolt. And it lasted from about 166 BC to about 163 BC, about 3 or 4 years. Well, it worked for a while. I mean, it went on and on and on, all the way up, and of course, eventually they were all squashed and killed, as they always are. But for about 3 years, they had independence. The next time they have independence as Israel, you might say, is 1945 or so, if you count the Constitution. So it's almost 2,000 years before, again, they would not be conquered by a foreign people. When Judas the Maccabeus came into the Jerusalem temple to cleanse, as he called it, they cleanse the temple. They came in to cleanse the temple, Judas Maccabeus. When he came into town, it says in 1 Maccabees, they waved palm branches. So the last major character they know of, which would have been in this time period, about 150 years, a little under 150 years or so before, roughly that. Well, a little more than that, I guess if you go 160, so maybe about 160, 170, 170 years, was Judas Maccabeus. If we think that's too distant, well, maybe it is for Americans. But the difference is they celebrate Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the celebration of Judas Maccabeus going to the temple and cleansing it. And the idea is that he went in there and the oil never ran out. When it's supposed to be replenished by the Levites or the priests all the time, it was still going all those days later. And so this day, Hanukkah is the festival of lights. While they light all these candles, that's supposed to happen. So there's a throwback. Again, my point is there's nationalistic zeal. This guy must be like Judas as well coming. And we know Judas was somewhat popular because his family names were still families were still naming their children after him and his family. So there are signs that there are certain Jews, not all of them, but who still very much thought, in fact, Jesus' own family had names like his brother, remember? Yes. Jude, which is Judas. Judas the Maccabean. His name is Judas. So these nationalistic hopes probably kept living on for quite some time. And this time period in this region, 170, 80 years, isn't 3,000 years ago. Nevertheless, it's not to say they think he's Judas, but to say we have every reason to think they're taking this very seriously as a royal entrance. And, verse 9, they were screaming something. They were screaming Psalm 118:25. Yeah, Psalm 118:25. This is a psalm that's known as a collection of psalms called the Hallel songs. These are songs that Jews would sing during Pesach, during Passover. It's a way. It's kind of like singing the national anthem. These are songs that celebrate this time when God rescued His people out of Egypt, and it's a very happy national. It's good to be a Jew. It's that sense. It's good to be a Jew, and they're shouting. Your translation probably literally transliterates Hosanna. Hosanna is literally Greek, but stay with me. It is a Greek way of saying two Hebrew words. Hoshana. Hoshana. Greek speakers, when you put Hoshana in Hebrew, which of course Greek speakers can't read Hebrew, they say it differently. They say, well, we say in the South, Hosanna, which literally means something along the lines of, Lord, help us. Lord, save us. Please save us. And by this time period, it may not mean literally Jesus save us, but more like a cry of acclamation, as in, we're so happy we're being saved. But they're shouting from that psalm, Hosanna, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. And that's, of course, what they think Jesus is. That's why they're singing it. And then, blessed is the kingdom. There we are again, royalty. This is the new president of our father David that is coming, Hosanna in the highest. Now, father can be literally like, Father Abraham had many sons. It could be the sense of he's an ancestor, but in other Old Testament texts, it means something along the lines of our Redeemer, our Rescuer. Father can be used as a metaphor that way. But Hosanna in the highest, and the Greek word epistois, highest, and descending in Aramaic, it can mean the highest degree, like very loudly, as much as I can mean it, or it can mean in the highest heavenly realms. Like, for example, in Luke 2, when the angels sing, it says, glory to God in the highest. That probably means the highest realms. That is there, and I've said this before, the shepherds are probably eavesdropping on a heavenly song. And the heavens have been ripped open. They could see inside the throne room. Here, I tend to mean that I tend to read this as to the highest degree, but y'all do what you want with that. But they are very excited Jesus is doing this. His donkey coming in. And you would think, and they would think, Jesus is going to go straight to the temple and cleanse it of any Romans that are there, because their Roman fortress Antonia is right there at the temple, and they brought in extra troops during Pesach, during Passover, because mobs and so forth could form, and Jesus does none of it. It's very, very anticlimactic. In verse 11, he enters Jerusalem, and he goes to the temple, and then looks around, and then goes to Bethany. But what he does, of course, is he looks around and sees how things are going. He sees how things are going. And now, historically, is it very likely that everybody in the audience knew that this guy thinks he's being king? Probably not, quite frankly. We must remember, think of Super Bowl or Mardi Gras or something where if you think of big crowds, Jerusalem's huge, in that sense, would have been fairly huge. A lot of people, there's no Twitter. There's no, hey, did you hear what happened? If you're not right there in the moment on that street, you wouldn't have seen it. People have been singing psalms anyway because it's the time for the season, like Christmas tunes. Now, they would have seen the waving. They got it somehow because it says they broke off leaving it to Jesus. But that crowd around him did. And almost certainly Romans would not have thought this guy is an upstart of the king, or they would have arrested him on the spot. So it's very unlikely that the Romans or anyone of important authority thought Jesus was trying to be an upstart. But a local, quick, what they call them, mobs, with flash mobs, something kind of appeared all of a sudden, celebrating Jesus. But he did not go into Rome. And he didn't come in conquering. He came in on a humble donkey. So he's royalty by the King David, by the lineage of David, yes. But this is important. I mean, it fits Jesus' ministry very well. His kingship is not characterized by domination. You will not lord it over them like the Gentiles do. Instead, this is how I'm king. I rescue the oppressed. I heal the sick, exorcise demons. I give forgiveness to people. And I do it on a humble donkey. I'm king, but you need to understand I'm a king in a certain way. And it's very important. Now, it's already late. It's probably not like midnight. It probably means it's late in the day of the temple activities because their evening starts when the sun sets. So their afternoon's like 3 o'clock. So the idea probably is it gets there late afternoon, early. It's like, it's our late. We're not gonna. It's a busy day. Let's get out of here. But he's gonna come back. He's gonna come back the next day. Any questions or comments about any of that? That's a mouthful.
You answered my question I was about to ask was, would the people have understood, because the whole colt, donkey, whatever it is, and that kind of stuff. So it seems like Jewish people would have maybe gotten that allusion or whatever to Zechariah, but if he's speaking to Greek people too, as they try to describe it later, they wouldn't understand that, right?
Right. So at least some people did seem to understand it, or they would have grabbed these branches and done stuff and shouted out songs to him. But Mark's audience, who are Greek speakers, probably would not have got the allusion to Zechariah 9:9 and whatever. What they would have caught, almost certainly, based on a lot of Greek and Roman texts, they know what a massive kingly entrance processional looks like. So Jesus here, Mark is probably trying to evoke that for his Gentile audience, but it's still trying to be true to what really happened. That is, it's still Jewish in its nature and its foundation. He's not on a white stallion. He's not those things. He didn't conquer a conquering hero, but they're sure treating him like he's a conquering hero. Yeah. On the following day, Jesus is going to come and do what he probably wanted to do the day one, but it was late. So the next day he's going to come back to the temple and do what he does. So, but Mark sandwiches, as we call it. It's a very fancy word. It's a narrative sandwich. So and we've seen this in Mark oftentimes. He'll start a narrative one way, and all of a sudden this sub story, and he finishes the first story. Remember this? He goes to help the woman, Jairus' daughter, and then a woman gets caught, and then Jairus' daughter's dead. I mean, he likes to sandwiches these things. And here's another example of it. So on this chance, there's a fig tree sandwich. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, see, remember, you go to bed, come back into town, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf. Now, fig tree is one of the most well-known fruit trees there in Israel. He went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. Now, Mark tells us that. It's not Jesus going, not the season for figs. It only had leaves. Now, almost certainly, Jesus and the disciples knew it's not literally fig season. But fig trees, as I've read from specialists, I'm not a horticulturist or whatever, as they've explained it to me, is if fig trees are going to bear fruit, they bear like baby premature figs along with leaves, and eventually the premature things will fall off and big ones grow, or the small ones eventually grow in season. They full grow season in the late summer and fall. Since we know it's Nisan 14th, which is what we call April, this is not the fall. So everyone knows full figs are not supposed to be there. But when he says he only sees leaves on it, it means it will not bear fruit. This is like a dormant or dead tree. So it's not that Jesus knows, they would have known there's no real figs right then in season. It's not that. The point is he only sees leaves and says, this one will not ever bear fruit. So again, let's set that up. What Mark is saying is Jesus was hungry looking for food. Maybe there's some over here, little remnants of an early fig, something I could probably eat. I don't know. And then he finds this one. Oh, this only has leaves. This is not going to produce any fruit ever. And on purpose, Jesus turns this fig tree into a little parable, basically. And he said to it, and this is the only time in the entire Gospels ever that Jesus has a negative miracle. This is where he condemns something. He sends something. May no one ever eat from you again. And disciples heard it. It's a curse. Now, curse doesn't mean he cussed it out. A curse, in a good biblical sense, just means it received God's judgment. Boy, Jesus condemned the apple tree and didn't give apples or bananas. No, right? If that's it, period, we go, that's weird. Mark sandwiches on purpose to make sure we understand it's not about the fig tree. It's not about a fig tree. It's a symbolic gesture of judgment. So the first, now we're going to come back to the fig tree in a little bit. Mark wants you to keep that in the back of your mind on purpose. When he came to Jerusalem and he entered the temple, again, probably from the east, but anyway, it doesn't really. At this point, it might be the east, it might be the south portico. Well, and I'll explain in a second. He entered the temple. He began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And pause here for a second. He had almost certainly come from the south side, there's different ways. But anyway, there's this massive, massive hallway, a stoa, that has, I think it's 40 columns. I mean, there's recreations. If you have a good map in the back, you can show or look on Google sometime. You can on a podcast or a study, but I have one on the back of my Bible here. But you can see these stoa would have been huge. It's just huge. And what we should picture here probably is this whole area has basically been turned into a marketplace. It's turned into a marketplace. Now, there's evidence in some later rabbinic material that says this marketplace like this didn't exist until just a few years before Jesus saw it like this. And it was headed up by the chief priest Caiaphas. Some scholars think Jesus is ticked off right now. I'll assume he's ticked off. There's not in the Greek anywhere. We'll assume he's upset to some degree. Some say he's upset because of the recent development of making this much more like a marketplace near the temple. And there are different interpretations. I'll come to that in just a second. But no matter what, we know exactly where he would have been. And there are money changers. What is this all about? In Passover, every Jewish male was required to give a temple tax. Everybody. And it was the equivalent of a half shekel, which isn't much money. The problem is, if you don't live near Jerusalem, you don't have shekels on you. You've got what's foreign currency. We have to imagine if I go to, Japan and get a yen or the euro in Europe or whatever, that even the yen in Japan lasts all over Japan. Or the American dollar lasts all over America. You have to imagine much more a place where the villages and towns next door might use totally different currency. So there's wildly different inflation and deflation cost of currency all over the place. One of the coins I love the most because it kept its value the most, usually because of the particular silver used, was in Tyre. It's called the Tyrian drachm. And it was about the equivalent of a half shekel. And so when you went to the temple, wherever your money you used, you changed it over to get the Tyrian drachm, which is roughly the equivalent of the half shekel required, unless you just had shekels on you. But again, most people that flooded in the Mardi Gras kind of thing didn't have it. It was necessary. It was necessary because in the Old Testament it says, basically, if you cannot keep your animal spotless, that is, you can't have a broken hoof or a leg, doesn't mean they can wash them off, yes, but you couldn't be injured at all. It wasn't acceptable. And so there's a huge pet raising zoo-like facilities all around the area, some of which we have archaeological evidence to some degree, that raised cattle, pigeons, doves, on, because they expect a huge influx for Passover. And you go in there, you give the temple tax. The temple tax helps pay for the offerings given on behalf of everyone. Those are sacrifices that the priest would do on behalf of everybody, but someone's got to pay for the animal, so the Jewish males do. And you have to offer your own stuff, your own offerings to be sacrificed. And you had to use their money. You couldn't use other foreign currency. One is because the value was bad, but all the second reason is because foreign currency might have images of different gods on it, or the kings. You didn't want to have those inside the Temple Mount. So they would come into town, most foreigners would, and bring cash with them, some cash, planning on buying animals, which they wouldn't turn. This is the temple system. Which means it's very important to understand, because in my experience in churches, this is always preached and taught wrong, quite frankly. Always outside of scholars. They don't know, bless their hearts, we'd say in the South. They mean well, but they're wrong. What they are doing by changing the money is necessary to keep the sacrifices going. When it says that, and those who sold pigeons, the pigeons themselves were the poorest. It's what the poor people gave. It's the smallest thing you could purchase. So the point is, everything from people changing over to buy, maybe rich people buying several goats or lamb or whatnot, to those who can only afford some pigeons, he overturned that, and those who sold those, the whole shebang. So it can't be because they are inherently immoral for changing money, because that is the sacrificial system. So it's not that. It's not that having money near that's not it. It has to be something else. I'm going to go over that in a second, okay? But first I'm just letting establish why there are money changers and whatever. If it is true that there's a marketplace that's newer in the time period that Caiaphas established, it's not that they never did this before, but rather probably that it was to the scale that it was, and that it was closer to the temple than it was. Now it's inside the Temple Mount. Temple Mount was huge. It was huge. I think if I recall my memory, something like 40 acres. So for them, I mean, it's a big, big area. And this is on the outskirts of the outskirts, but still it was within sight of the temple. And he wouldn't allow anyone to carry anything to the temple. And that word that can use in verse 16 of anything, the skouos, any vessel, anything can't be passed. And that means it's not just about the money changers. It's not just about the doves. He doesn't just hate doves or the people who do it. He doesn't just hate vessels. Jesus is clearly trying to, at minimum, he's trying to make a massive symbolic gesture that the sacrificial system right now is defunct. These vessels, these skouos, that's even what priests could use for their necessary things. So this is, you have to imagine something like, well, I like to picture, like a bazaar. I've been to Egypt a couple times. It's kind of loud and raucous. You have the smells. I mean, you'd have seen smoke in different areas where animals were being killed almost around the clock, basically. It would have smelled like a zoo. I mean, it would have smelled like dried blood, kind of. People stunk, and food, drink, all over. I mean, you're rubbing shoulders with people most of the day because they're all going, hey, man, what's up? All right, how much does this cost me? Here's my money. Let's go to buy that one. All right, I'll take care of them here. I mean, it's just family reunions, teachers teaching, people preaching, prophets walk around saying the end is near. I mean, all kinds of stuff. It's just been kind of a crazy deal. But then Jesus gives us some insight, and quite frankly, we're just not clear. Scholars, and y'all can make up your own mind, it's not very clear what he's critiquing, and I'll tell you what I mean here. In verse 17, and he taught. So Jesus does all this stuff, and he starts teaching. Now, just picture that for a second. It can't be that Jesus really thought what he's doing was stop the sacrifices at the temple. There's no way. There's way too many tables. I mean, he didn't overturn the table down the road. Had he done that to every single table, they would have picked it back up, put the money back in the changers, and said, who's next? I mean, it would have been irritating. In John's gospel, he makes a whip and starts whipping the snot out of him. He really makes a scene. But it can't be that Jesus, he's not an idiot. Like, they're going to keep going the next day of the sacrifice. They're going to keep going. So it has to be a symbolic gesture. And so much so, in Mark's gospel, it cuts straight from, he overturned, he's going crazy, and he starts teaching. Well, does he walk off and teach? Does he stop right there and say, I did this because? It doesn't tell us. My own view is that he does it within the context of the tables, that he's explaining why he's mad. Not maybe mad, but it's a judgment. I'm always concerned about saying the words like mad and ticked off because it might give the impression that Jesus is doing this just because he's upset somehow, like he's in a bad mood. No, that's not. It's more like a righteous indignation.
It's likely he didn't just have two sentences.
Right. That's right. It's more likely he didn't have just two sentences. That's probably exactly right. But these are the two sentences that they remember is that, oh yeah, he quoted a blank and he quoted so-and-so. He could have he taught and says, and he quotes from Isaiah 56, is it not written, my house shall be called, and house is the temple, shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Now I want to pause there. That's an awesome one. It is common in Judaism to call God, the temple, the house of God. It's just a standard way in the ancient world that gods dwell there, they live there. Everybody believed it, everybody. Jews believe that God's glory, his Shekinah glory, was certainly in the temple, but they didn't think it was really there right now. They think the temple, the glory of God of the temple actually had left. They were waiting for it to return. If you read your prophets carefully, like in Malachi and so forth, they thought it disappeared and they wanted him to come back and filled up. God's presence was still there, but it wasn't like at all like when Solomon and the Spirit filled the temple. Having said that, the temple was still the central, concentrated presence of God, though he could be present anywhere. Everybody believed the temple was the main spot for the deity, and Jews are no exception. Little footnote. I say this all the time, but it's worth repeating. In Luke's gospel, when Jesus is the parents of the year, where's Jesus? I thought you had him. They go back and find him in the temple, and he says, where were you? Didn't you know I had to be at my father's house? And this is where everybody goes, see, that's his daddy. He's in the crib. No, he just says, well, the point is, didn't you know I was going to be at the temple? This is where I'm supposed to be learning. And that's what he says. He's learning from the rabbis there at the temple. So it's the temple. The Father's house is the temple. Isaiah says, God the Father says, it's going to be called a house of prayer for all nations. The point is because it should be. Isaiah's vision in Isaiah 56, from Isaiah, well, it's certainly Isaiah 50s in the chapters and later, his vision is that the Jews have been in Babylon, they're going to come back home from Babylon exile. It's one of hope, and it's a vision where the Jews, when they come back, will be, and this is only in Isaiah, They will be a light to the nations. When you hear nation, it's very important if you read your Bible carefully. When you see the word nation, you should 99% of the time should think Gentile. Think us. Not just, oh, how about that? Just different flags waving. No, it means anybody who's not a Jew. That means Isaiah believed, or whoever wrote 3rd Isaiah, that section of Isaiah, they believe that God says the vision God has for his people is not that Jews become more exclusive, but inclusive. A light to the nations means something along the lines of they can guide the nations to God. And little footnote, again, when I did my Matthew study, I said this. When Matthew's gospel, Matthew 5, when Jesus says, you are the light of the world, most scholars concur, that's saying you, my disciples, are. Not the Jewish nation as you understand it, but you are. And that's a big deal because that's a divine commission by God to be the light to all the nations. And here he's saying, Isaiah says, isn't that the role of my temple? That all the people from all over the world would have access to this place to meet me and pray to me. So at least we know Jesus is upset, he's judgmental, because he at least thinks the temple is not being that place. Now here's the question. Why? What were they doing to make Jesus think they were not being that place? There's different answers, and I'm not sure if we can ever know for sure. For example, in the Old Testament, the temple was divided into regions. But there were 2 regions, where priests went or where the people went, basically. By the time Jesus and the second temple was built, that's not true. There's divisions all over the place. There's the priest, the inner holy, basically. Not the Holy of Holies once a year, but the region right beside it where they did the sacrifices. You go a step farther out, and you have, well, of course, priest helpers, Levites. Then you have Jewish men. Then you have Jewish women on a lower level, way farther out. Then you have the court of the Gentiles, which is the farthest corners. So what's happened is by gender, and yes, gender or sex, and by nationality, you might say ethnicity, you're being farther and farther removed from God's presence. So is Jesus, I'll say the word ticked off from the southern, is he ticked off because what's happened is they've become so exclusive the Gentiles can't get close at all? And that's not prescribed in the Bible. It's not prescribed Gentiles should never ever be near. Is that what he's ticked off about? Does he look around? He says he goes in and looks around. That's in verse 11. He looked around at everything. Does he look around and go, why in the world aren't these people from, and yes, some Gentiles could come to the temple to pray. Some were called God-fearers. They weren't full-on Jews yet by religion, but they respected the Jewish religion. Does he look around and go, why aren't those guys from Rome and in Egypt? Why aren't they up close and personal? Why is it you kick them way over here? Maybe he's ticked off about that. Maybe he's ticked off in the fact that he doesn't see, that's one option. Maybe it's all of these. Is he ticked off because he sees now this marketplace has now dominated the feel and tone of the whole temple, and that's what's ticking him off. Not so much the non-Gentile part, but it can't be a house of prayer, that is of worship and prayer, because now we got all this daggum bizarre, B-I-Z-A-R-R-E, right? When I walk into this place is B-I is a bizarre, like a... B-A? Oh, of course. Yeah, it's not bizarre. This strange place. Sorry, it is a bazaar. Right. Bazaar. Is that the issue? It's a problem basically that it's become a crazy marketplace thing. And there's no way the point is, you can't focus on God. It's a massive distraction. It can't be a house of prayer if you've got all this crap going on. Is that his frustration? That's the first problem. The first verse is, or he is upset. Somehow he's upset about the exact issue, but what's causing that upsetness? The next thing is, you've made a den of, it's not robbers. And that's the real problem. Jeremiah 7, it's a different verse. The Greek word listis means not robber. It means bandit. It means criminal. If they were on sea, you'd call them a pirate. I mean, it's a bandit. And so you can say robber is fine, but that's not, the point is these are brigands. These are people who hurt and take advantage of people. That's a better word. A little footnote, in the Gospels, every time it's said, and everyone always says this, but now it's just ensconced in English memory. It's American English. Jesus was crucified between, they always say, what? 2 thieves. That's not what the Greek, it's 2 listes. There were 2 bandits. To Rome, those people weren't thieves. They were terrorists. You can translate leastis that way, depending on your context. Jesus was considered a terrorist to Rome. They were leastis, terrorists. They didn't get crucified because they stole some loaves of bread or stole gold. That's not why they got stolen, because they were bandits. They were people who wanted to fight against people. And that's the same word used here. That's a profound condemnation. And Jeremiah's context in Jeremiah chapter 7, it's against the religious leadership who are taking advantage of the poor. They're not fighting for the cause of the poor. And instead what they're doing is they exploit, and that you might metaphorically say they rob the people maybe, but they exploit, they usurp the authority, what they should be is rising up to take care of the outcast, and then they run back to the temple, maybe somewhat literally, but probably metaphorically, and hide like it is a den of leastis. That is, they're hiding with their loot, yeah, okay, but they're hiding because they're scared of the authorities. In Jeremiah's vision and his condemnation, his judgment, is that the Jewish leadership thinks they're safe in the den, but they're not. In Jeremiah's vision, they will be condemned terribly bad. You can run to the temple all you want. You're running to the very place where you're going to receive the judgment. Jesus uses that exact verse against what's going on as he sees it. Here's the problem. But clearly he thinks it fits well. Is it a problem because the Jewish leadership are they also not taking care of or taking advantage of the poor as they should be, like in Jeremiah's context? That is a possible reading. Later on, we'll see Jesus says the woman who gives out of her, she gives 2 bits. She gives out everything she has. Well, a lot of scholars, there's one scholar particularly who wrote an article who convinced most of us, said when you read it carefully, he's condemning the temple leadership. They should be taking care of the poor. Or should we read it where he is leaning towards the robbing part, like thieves, leaning that way? If that's the case, that ties in if he's condemning because of the marketplace. Some Jewish texts later on, I forgot to say this, did suggest that people who changed money could skim off the top and charge exorbitant amounts. That might have been going on too. The text doesn't say that. See, the text, that's the thing about it. Mark he either wants you to assume a lot, he assumes you know it, and then it changes your interpretation. Or if you go just on what he says, this is not about they made too much money, they skimmed off the top, and whatever. He's condemning them here at least because at minimum, in general, you can say this, the temple has lost its function. It's lost its function. Here's another question that scholars ask they do all the time.
Hold on. About that, I was thinking that making it too difficult, kind of like you're talking about the outskirts too. We don't have the right money, so we got to change it for this money, or we got to do this to be able to get this, to even be able to get access to get what I need to be able to do my sacrifice. So I don't know if that would have anything.
Right, so you're saying it's a way of making it more difficult for people to get to the access to God because they have to change the money. But most scholars, though, would say what I said earlier to that, which is it's just that it is commanded in the Old Testament, or at least highly suggested that this system is what should be done because of the logic. It's a gracious thing to do. That is, instead of saying you all, no matter where you come from, must bring your own unblemished animal. Hey, come, we'll take care of that for you. Just come buy it. In fact, in the Old Testament, it's not just animals. You actually come and can buy liquor. The word is liquor. You can get liquor and get drunk there. And it says, in the presence of the Lord. You eat feast like making a big fat barbecue. You'll never hear that preached. The exact word, I think, it is. In Hebrew, it means that. So the point is, you kind of save up some cash, you go there. But all that to say, maybe, Elaine, but it just seems to be the case that if we assume the Old Testament's to bear, then Jesus probably would have seen this as a necessity that some money changing is occurring. They've got to buy the...
So say what you said again about the temple.
Well, that's the last thing. So Jesus is clearly, I say clearly. Okay, I don't like to use that word much, but when I do, I try to use it confidently. I think it's clear Jesus is, to some degree, judging the temple and its function. Period. It's lost its function. Here's the question that scholars like to also keep debating. Does Jesus think all temples at all times have lost their function? Or is he just condemning this particular temple leadership? Before we go, it's clearly this or that. Well, maybe it is. The problem is, for example, let's look at the Jewish group called the Essenes. The Essenes primarily lived around Qumran. They lived all kinds of places. They also condemned the temple and its leadership. Very much so. Most believe that they call this the teacher of righteousness was their main leader. He probably was a priest at the temple who was said the temple's so corrupt he went and started his own church. That's basically what happened, probably. And he thought, hell, they're going to be held to pay, judgment to pay on all those corrupt, nasty Jews at the temple. But they still believed in the temple. Temple's still good, but the leadership's corrupt. Is that what Jesus believed too? Is that we still in temple? Another thing that puts kind of a fly in the ointment is we know for a fact, according to Acts, that the disciples to some degree kept going to the temple. For example, in Acts chapter 2, it says they go back to at least to pray, because it says Peter and the disciples go back during the hours of prayer. So that's one thing. We know they at least to go pray. The other thing is later on in the gospel, it says they went at the very end when Paul comes back in town before he's arrested. He's going there and he encourages Timothy, okay, well, give a sacrifice. We'll give the circumcision. We'll have the sacrifice that's supposed to go along with it. But that, again, those are two examples we know of. Some scholars say, see, they still went all to the temple. I don't find that convincing. You can go to the Temple Mount and do things and not give an offering that you thought had something to do with forgiveness or sacrifice. That is to say, the earliest Christians still go to the temple and say, but yeah, the temple still lost its function when Jesus died. Or did the earliest Christians go, no, the temple's still functional. We just worship Jesus too. The evidence isn't as clear as it wants to be. We know the temple was destroyed in AD 70. Then nobody went to the temple. It's just you don't have a whole lot of theology outside of John's Gospel and Hebrews that really makes it clear that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. You don't need sacrifices. Hebrew just belabors the point. So scholars are divided on Jesus' actual view of the temple or the religious leadership or its function. Okay, you can have your own view. So what is he mad about? Was it a distraction? Was this money changing a distraction? That's what he's ticked off about. Is he ticked off because the Gentiles are kicked out too far away from God's presence, they might say? Is he ticked off because it's such a noisy ruckus that it can't be a focus of worship and prayer to God because you're too busy doing all this nonsense? Is he upset because Caiaphas had the marketplace put in too close to the temple? Is he upset because he thinks the religious leadership are taking advantage of the poor and whatnot, and they can hide in the temple, and they're not going to be hiding, judgment's coming? You get to decide. Maybe it's a little all of the above. What I do believe very much, and most scholars concur, very much so, whatever it is, these nuances you want to nail yourself down to, or even if you do, Jesus is condemning some degree of the function of the temple. I think there's no doubt about that. As Mark presents it, he is denouncing the function of the temple, no doubt about it. If you go the typical traditional Christian response, if you want to know what that is, the typical traditional Christian response is he is condemning the entire sacrificial system. That is a symbolic gesture of saying the whole show, not just that the marketplaces do close, not just they're skimming off the top, not just because the Gentiles, but I'm deliberately stopping for a second things moving in the temple as best as I can, overturning. I am stopping the necessary machine. It comes to a halt just for a little bit to demonstrate my judgment on all of it. I find that quite convincing, but I like to give you little historical nuggets of scholars arguing.
He's not saying this necessarily, but maybe it's like that system's wrong because I'm the sacrifice.
So you said maybe he's saying maybe that system is wrong because I'm the sacrifice. Most New Testament interpreters say, at least they say, at minimum they'll say, that's got to be how the earliest Christians read it. So then the question is, maybe don't care about this, historically speaking, historians go, well, then to agree, okay, surely early Christians thought that about Jesus, that Jesus' death was the ultimate sacrifice. We don't need to go to the temple. But I already told you there's one hiccup in that. One is in Acts, there's at least 2 times they go to the temple. They're still hanging around there, just doing something. That's one hiccup for being just a clear-cut case. The second major issue is, I can't remember what it is now, but there were 2. The early Christians did believe that Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice. That sacrifice that shows up in several texts, not just Hebrews. But the question then is, to what degree has Mark and Matthew and Luke and even John shaped the narrative to fit that post-resurrection, post-death belief? And there's no, in my opinion, there's no for sure. John goes all out John's gospel goes out at the beginning when John the Baptizer says, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. In John's gospel, Jesus dies specifically, probably on a Friday, but the day of preparation. That's the day when the lambs are being killed.
He says, it is finished. He's done. He tells
So I'm going to notice that lamb dying as sacrifice becomes very explicit in John's gospel. But Mark doesn't go, he's not as hardcore about that. He's just not. Mark's not. He's not. But it's certainly true that early Christians thought the temple would become completely irrelevant. The early church fathers who wrote about it consistently said the structure of the temple was God's judgment on the Jews for what they did to Jesus. I don't know if I find that convincing, but that's a common belief.
This is one of the things that frustrates me about the way I was taught growing up, and I think it's just out of ignorance, but I've told you this, but when I was young, you couldn't sell anything in the church because of this passage. And so like in the vestibule, which we had, the little opening or the whatever you call it, if you had t-shirts to sell for a youth group or you were having a fundraiser, you couldn't do it in the sanctuary or that area. Now that has really laxed since I was young, but that was a big thing. And I don't think at all that was I think they were trying to follow what they thought was the right thing. How in the world would you know? I didn't know until I grew up and read it and learned from you. How in the world would you know that unless you read commentaries?
So how would you know that this is not just don't sell things? I don't know how God would have to reveal it to you.
Become an immature Christian, because so many times, I can think of people, I can name people and I won't, but so many, very popular, well sold Bible studies and things like that would teach things just like this.
Absolutely would. Right. If the takeaway is don't sell stuff in church versus the takeaway is Jesus is condemning the function and purpose of the temple and the sacrificial system because at least he is the sacrifice, it's a very different takeaway.
Because it sets us up for being very baby Christians and not understanding the teachings of Jesus and stuff. And I feel like even having grown up in church and read my Bible regularly and whatever, there's so many things that I was taught implicitly, sometimes explicitly, not because they didn't know. These are people, God-fearing people that are disciples of Jesus that just didn't know, and it makes me sad because there's so many things that are not taught with that real takeaway. Because when you hear it, you're like, oh, that totally makes sense. So, just my 2 cents.
To make some, I think, of course, we've discussed this a little before, but just to maybe say it for the podcast and those listening in person, what you just said is one of the many, many, many reasons why I'm weird. And of course you think this, David, because I disagree with people who say all you need is Bible and the Spirit and you're fine. I disagree with them. I disagree with them because of over 20 years of ministerial pastoral experience and almost 30 years of education and pastoral experience and life of scholarship, whatever. I don't mind. Let's just count it at 20. The point is, I've seen it constantly that people need guides. So have over 20 years of anecdotal evidence mixed with any pastor I know. The second reason I would say that's false is the Bible itself disagrees with that. In the Old Testament, when the book of the law the covenant was found, which is probably the Torah, or at least Deuteronomy, and it calls Josiah's entire reforms, it says they have people walk around and explaining the text to them. An earlier church.
Why have teachers?
Why have teachers? Why have a spiritual gift called teacher? What does the eunuch say to Philip? He said, "What you reading there?" I'm reading Isaiah. You know what it means? How would I, unless someone instructs me? And I thought about putting that Greek in my office one time to put that right. How would I if no one instructs me? That flies in the face. And I know there's a long reason why, particularly amongst the Baptist tradition, which emphasizes so much the priesthood of all the believer, which again, historically is not the point. When that emphasis of the priesthood of all believer, it was not that you don't listen to teachers. The people who were Baptist, early church, in that sense, fathers, they taught people. It's that I don't need a priest to speak to God on my behalf. I can speak directly. They're not a sacred role where I have to go to them to receive answers to prayer and so forth. That's the point. Or forgiveness. I get forgiveness from Jesus. I talk to him personally. It has nothing to do. But what happened in the last couple centuries, it's just overwhelming ignorance. They think that means, no. I don't need anything at all. And it's to fight against, and I've heard it and experienced it, that a lot of times it's a deep-seated pushback to authoritarian interpretation. And it really, really jives perfectly well with the American democratic freedom, meism. It just does. It sounds very American to say, you can't tell me what to do and believe. It just does. It just fits perfectly. And then you drive that with, I'm a priesthood unbeliever. You just put all these things together. It's a way of saying, you can't tell me what it means. And if you say that, it means, I've had people hold the Bible up. You mean tell me I don't understand this if I don't need someone telling me what to believe? I would say, no. I think God can speak to anybody anytime he wants to. He can speak through donkeys, donkey teachers, or donkeys humans, creatures. But I'm just convinced that God has designed it such that there are certain people with a gift of teaching who go and get the research and help us. And we shouldn't be ashamed of that. It shouldn't be hidden under a bushel. It should be claimed to go, yeah, I don't know why in the world that'd be the case. That's my first major reflection, is to say that I think having teachers is God ordained. Yes, that sounds self-serving. That's not why I'm saying it. It's not. But anyway, I think I'm giving evidence otherwise. The other quick things I'd say is, you know this, but I used to lead a professional male quartet, and we always had to ask the question, always did, can we sell our product there? We have CDs and tapes. We had tapes for a while. And y'all are old enough to know what tapes are. And I always had to ask that question. Oh yeah, and I would say, where can we do it? And some were adamant, immediately would say, oh, you can't say them in the sanctuary, can't sell them near the sanctuary. We'll let them say out by the hallway, by the water fountain. And sometimes it'd be literally like 3 corners away in the middle of nowhere, because it wouldn't be near the sanctuary. Maybe because they didn't like it, or maybe because people would fuss if it were. Others like, oh yeah, sounds cool. I mean, we encountered it all the time, and I never ever had a discussion with them about that. So I did experience all the time based on this. My encouragement is they might be right. It might be the case that God really hates it when people sell things and make profit near that. Maybe. My response is, at what this text cannot mean, my view. In other words, they might be right. Okay, I say it about most things, and maybe I'm just dead wrong. My response, though, is they can't be right for multiple reasons. One is churches don't have sanctuaries. Churches are not temples. That ignorance is so profligated. It is pronounced. It's all over the place. All the time. And I call it, when I go to a new place, I'll call it sanctuary. You know that for years, because that's what they call it. I don't like calling that. Sanctuary, from the Latin sanctus, a holy site. They think they get that because that's what the Roman Catholics call it, because they're priests. They think that it is a holy spot where you are re-sacrificing the body of the temple at Mass over and over and over. That's why Mass is the central element of worship, because they think you're receiving forgiveness because you're re-sacrificing the actual body and blood of Jesus. I find that overwhelmingly unconvincing and false. In the New Testament, churches did not have a sanctuary. The first building of a church didn't happen probably until the mid-4th century. Let's go crazy and say mid-3rd. 250 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Then what happens? None of these people were able to preach and teach without a sanctuary. They didn't have one. They didn't come until the Roman Catholics and priests, and now all of a sudden makes a Protestant church. One is, that's why. First off, there is no such thing as a sanctuary. That's bad theology for a Christian. It fits perfectly if I time travel in the Old Testament. In the time of Jesus. Perfect. Not now. It's bad theology. And that's what I would say to those people. One thing is, whatever this text means, it cannot mean that. There's no such thing as a sanctuary in church. The second thing I'd say is, it cannot mean that because at most this applies not to churches which do not exist, but to the temple, which did exist. It wouldn't make any sense to apply everything that ever occurs at the temple to apply that to a church building, which didn't exist for centuries. You might say, well, it does mean that. Okay. I just don't find that convincing. I just don't find it convincing at all. I can't fathom why anyone would find that convincing. To think that Jesus' condemnation of the temple around the year AD 30, maybe April 2nd, applies to all future church gatherings thenceforth. That blows my mind. So they might be right. And frankly, we've had this conversation, I would rather them be more stringent on this issue because they think that's what honors him than not do it because they don't give a rip. Sure. Every day, all the time. At least they're trying to follow it. At least they're trying to take it seriously, bring it on. That's my view. But if they ask my opinion, I'll tell. And if I was a pastor, I would never ever say that. I would never say you can't sell. I would never say.
Is that why people call the sanctuary oftentimes now a worship center?
Yeah, the worship
Sounded
center,
modern.
it just sounds modern, yeah. But I prefer worship center because that's what it is. I'm there to worship. That's not why. That's one of the reasons why I'm there. But I'll wrap up on. Oh, sorry. I didn't finish the little section here. The chief priests and the scribes. Chief priests are the main dudes there. They're the main leaders. You need to understand, in Jerusalem, the chief priests were the big dogs in Judaism. Scribes typically means their scribes, people who help write for them, like lawyers. Because not all priests could read or write, for sure. But the scribes usually could. They heard it, and they sought a way to destroy him. So whatever it is Jesus is condemning and why he did it, in Mark's gospel at least, and all the gospels, this made them infuriated. For they feared him, but the multitude was astonished at his teaching. So they're just, what? And we saw in Mark's gospel, they're always just, what in the world? This guy's amazing. Or they think he's crazy. But the Jewish leaders want to kill him. That's it. Do they want to kill him because of his condemnation when he quotes Isaiah and Jeremiah? Maybe. Do they want to kill him because he overturns the money changers and screws everything up for a little bit? Maybe. My own view is that it's probably both. The symbolic gesture. The reason why I just did that. Do you know your Old Testament? Remember in Jeremiah, prophets did some weird things. Supposedly Isaiah laid on each side for a year and a half to prove a point. Like, what in the world? Jeremiah got clay pots and crushed them. He crushed them in Jeremiah, and he did that not because he hates pots. I'm mad at the pot. It was a symbolic gesture of the destruction about to come to Israel. Well, everyone in scholarship, this is Jesus' prophetic parable. It's an outward manifestation, and it seems to me that the leaders got it. That he's acting like an old school prophet who does a symbolic out loud, like Hosea marrying a slut. It's a gesture. Evening came, they went out of the city. They get out. So there's no Romans don't get him. He's not in trouble right now besides the schemers. And as they pass by in the morning, the next day, right, they come out of Bethany, they see the fig tree that withered away to its roots. The very first root be gone. What's that root killer?
Oh.
Weed.
No, weed. What's it called? What's the weed stuff you call it? It kills the weeds.
Roundup.
Yeah.
Roundup. Very first Roundup. I always picture Roundup right here. You turn the fireplace on? Yeah. And Peter remembered, said, "Hey, master," or it literally is rabbi. It means my master, my Lord, my great one. Look, the fig tree which you cursed is withered. Jesus said, "Have faith in God." What in the world? Why in the world would he say, "Have faith in God"? Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, "Be taken up and cast to the sea," and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that he will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you've received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive. If you have any question concerning anyone, so that have anything against anyone, so that your Father also is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. We're actually going to stop. I'm going to explain that part as best I can. We're going to stop there because the next section is a great block together of controversial. They test Jesus. This finishes the sandwich and we'll be done. This is just weird. Sharon Dowd, I think, has by far the best explanation, and I really do. And she did an entire dissertation on this exact topic, these exact verses. I find her argument by far the best, most convincing. She was one of my professors when I was doing New Testament PhD. And there's a couple assumptions here that I have to back up, and she backs them all up with tons and tons of citations, and I think she's exactly right. I'll say this pretty quickly. You have to remember that everybody, Jew, Greek, and Roman, as I said before, they believed in general that the temple was the central place of the gods. The corollary is it means that everybody believed if you wanted your prayers heard, you had to go to the temple. Oh, and Egyptians too. You had to go to the temple. In fact, in Egypt, they had certain temples with walls that were built inside the inner sanctums with holes in it. And the idea is that you would say your prayer in the holes and be heard by the gods. You had to go there. This was common assumption, and she lists tons of citations, and I think she's right, that in general, in fact, so much so, different religions, including Jews and then Muslims and whatever, would pray toward the temple. I can't be there. I want to pray toward it because that's where God will hear my prayer. And Muslims to this day still pray. Well, originally they prayed toward Jerusalem. Now they pray toward Mecca. And Muhammad switched it probably when the Jews wouldn't convert. So he had to kill them. But anyway, eventually they were all praying to Jerusalem at first. So everyone believed that. That's very important. Well, that brings up the immediate problem. Jesus just condemned this fig tree, which clearly represents the temple. I say clearly, it's clear to me and almost every interpreter. The fig tree represents the inadequacy of bearing fruit, as he says it wouldn't. The temple is not bearing fruit. It's not being a house of all nations. It's bad guys are leading it. Well, here's the problem, Jesus. If the temple is going to be gone, if it's going to be withered away, hence destroyed, now what? And it probably was a real, genuine, existential faith crisis of the earliest Jews who were Christians when the temple fell in AD 70. Even the promise that it would be withered would make people go probably a bit crazy. If that happens, will God ever hear our prayers? Why even pray? When that little footnote here, when the temple did fall, when it was destroyed, the rabbis actually had to wrestle with this a lot. And it's on the literature. The rabbis did all on. And because they said, no, well, all that matters is not the sacrifice, but now it's the act of prayer. And rabbis said, of course he still hears the prayer. They would cite these Old Testament texts to try to encourage their people. He's still listening. He's still listening. And to this day, Jews, Orthodox and conservative Jews will say that my sacrifice is a sacrificial life of prayer and almsgiving. So it's a big deal when the temple fell, and it was dependable just to say it's going to fall. It's a big deal. So the first thing is, Sharon Dowd makes the argument, is the reason why Mark puts this here is because it's their way of addressing the early Christian community of saying, I'm telling you, he still hears your prayer even though the temple's been destroyed. The second major thing is the temple doesn't matter much anyway because it wasn't being a house of all nations, a house of prayer for all the nations. Now, where is this house of prayer for all the nations? Where is it? It's not a house anymore, the temple. Now it's Christianese here. Where is God's Spirit now? He's in the Christian community. He's in church. I don't go to a house anymore. Now it's in the Christian community. Remember, who are my mothers, my brothers, and sisters? Those who do the will of God. And so most interpreters, and Dowd and others say this, is that's the earliest Christians who are reading this, right? Like probably in Romans, one of the places. Well, the temple's been destroyed or I can't get there. No worries. No worries. The function of the house lost the house of God lost its function. The Spirit is no longer limited primarily to that location. Now, of course, they believe that very much because they're Christians by this point. They believe in the death and resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit. But the first major point is that it makes perfect sense that there would have been a genuine faith crisis. Will God hear our prayers if the temple's destroyed? 2, it's a way of encouraging them saying, of course, because it had failed anyway, we now become a house of all the nations. Now think about that. If I'm a Gentile, Greek-speaking Gentile, who's now a Christian, and I've been told that the purpose of the temple is to be a house of all prayer for all the nations, that's me and you. That's very encouraging. The third thing it's really important, is tied in, is many, many different schools of thought, Greek and Roman, to some degree Jewish, but certainly Greeks and Romans, they disagreed on whether or not the gods really could do whatever they wanted. Some gods argue that they couldn't. They were very limited in their power and scope. Some said, no, they are unlimited. They went back and forth. In general, Jews always agreed God had no limits. Well, if you're a Gentile convert and you came from your background with different religions, one of the things that mattered, it was like a live debate, was whether or not the gods, would it even matter even to pray? Because the gods, some, the Epicureans, others said, doesn't matter what you do, the gods are stuck into, they're strict determinists. It doesn't matter what you do because they're stuck too. The gods, everyone's stuck in this determinism plot of life, and on it went. So the third major thing is that exactly what he says about what God can do, which is, of course, have faith in him. And when he says, the assumption that whatever you ask will be done or can be done, that's the main thing. Not to mention several times in Mark's gospel, it says nothing is impossible with God, right? Those kind of things, like the rich can inherit and so forth. So it's another response is not only is prayer is still going to work, even though the temple's destroyed, it will also work because it can still happen because God's not limited. He's not limited. The other thing I would say is, it was common in Judaism, semi-common, and the Jewish teachers later on, to use the analogy of a mountain being cast around. Everybody believes, at least in scholarship, that that's just hyperbole, that we read that's hyperbole, that it doesn't mean at all that Jesus really means you can move mountains instead of, you don't need tractors, just pray about it. You can build a building. I mean, it's not at all. It's a way of saying you can do the impossible with God. When the later Jewish rabbis use it, they use it in the sense of if you study Torah, you can do anything. Here, he's saying not that. I say to you, whoever says this mountain, be taken up and cast to the sea, but don't doubt and believe that it'll come to pass, it'll be done for him. It seems to me in most that Jesus' point here is hyperbolic on purpose. You need to have faith in God. That is to say, you can translate this way, trust God. Trust God. Trust God. Have faith. Have faith. He can do the impossible. You've got to have faith. Don't think he abandoned you because the temple is destroyed. Have faith. Trust him. Whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you've received it and it will be yours. What it can't mean, unless Jesus is a hypocrite or Mark's crazy or something like that, I don't think either of those things are true, it can't mean literally like a genie in the bottle, whatever you want, you get it. It can't mean that. I just gave you one verse of several I could go to where clearly that didn't happen. It didn't happen. I can go to many, many other verses in the Bible, James, that says you don't receive what you pray for because you ask for the wrong things. You can go to all kinds of places in the Bible with that kind of theology. My own view is I'm convinced this is deliberately hyperbolic as a way of challenging this early Christian community to which Mark writes. Challenge them. You've got to be expectant that God is with you and is listening to your prayers. And surely he would have meant to them. And when you ask things that God wants, you need to be confident they're going to happen. There's no conceivable way that this can be used like prosperity preachers mean it. If you just believe enough and have a lot of faith, you're going to get it. Verse 24 is one of their favorite verses. If you believe and receive it, it's that word of faith. That cannot be what he means. Nothing in the ministry or the teaching of Jesus fits that. There's no conceivable way Jesus really thought, disciples, I'm telling you what, you ask for a car, it's going to pop into existence. He wasn't an idiot. It can't mean that. In the context of the teaching of Jesus, the assumption has to be what the book of James says explicitly, which is you ask and don't receive because you ask where he says for things of the flesh. You don't ask for the right things. Surely the assumption has to be when you're lockstep with the king in the kingdom of God and he has you that kind of conviction, then you ask in prayer, yep, you're going to get it. When you want what the king wants, you're going to get it. It doesn't say that exact thing explicitly. I'm convinced it has to be there. C.S. Lewis talks about this exact section in his book, chiefly on to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, and he gives some options and stuff, but he's not a biblical exegete. But so he takes it to be, well, either this is a kind of faith that I've never experienced, or most people don't. That is, they can do whatever they want whenever they want it, and that's possible. Bless Lewis's heart, I don't think that's true. I think these verses 23 and 24, are deliberately hyperbolic to prove the point, to make the point. It really encourages this Christian audience, the congregation. You've got to keep praying. You've got to keep doing it. And if you really want to be heard by God, and this is I think my last major point of the section. Instead of emphasizing what James does in his epistle when he says, you ask for the wrong things, that's why you don't get it. Mark has Jesus say something else. It doesn't say it's exhaustive. There's at least one of the reasons you don't get what you want is because you're not being forgiving. Whenever you stand praying, in verse 25, and Jews did stand and pray. It was a standard thing. Oftentimes their hands upraised. Does that mean we'd all pray forever? I had to do this footnote because I like to. When people say, well, the Bible says, we always pick and choose what the things are. Well, it says when you stand praying. Is this a moral imperative? Let me say it this way. Is it sinful not to stand when you pray? A lot of people, I think, probably by custom, might not really believe it, but they kind of imply, they go, let's stand and pray together. Like you've got to stand all the time. But Jesus never commanded it. He assumed it. He never commanded to fast. He says, but when you fast, in Matthew, right, remember 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, when you fast, clean yourself up and whatever. He didn't say to fast, it's when you do it. That's the issue. In my own view, this is one of the many, many examples, even through Paul's letters, where if something is not prescribed, it doesn't mean the implication is prescribed. For example, Paul says to Timothy, elders should have one wife. Now, almost virtually every scholar concurs that means you can't be sleeping around and have multiple women on the side. That's the point. Not, it must be a man. He doesn't say elders must be men. He never says that. He says they must be, it literally says in Greek, it's weird, it's like a one-wife man. Does that make sense? So he never says he's got to be a man, but he assumes it. But of course he does. Every single Jewish elder would have been a man. Of course he does. Does that mean you're sinning if elders are women? There are a lot of churches who say, absolutely, because it says, how could a woman be a one-woman wife? I mean, I get it. He did assume it. Same thing here. Jesus assumes whenever you pray, or at least Mark, said. Anyway, all that to say, when you say in prayer, forgive, and if you have anything against anyone, if your Father also in heaven may forgive you of your trespasses. Which kind of sounds, of course, like Matthew 5:21, right? Remember the model prayer? Forgive as you have been forgiven. Forgive us as we have forgiven others. That seems to have been a real basic tenet of the early Christian community, that it was one based on forgiveness and not holding grudges. What Mark is saying here by this context, of all the things, just repeat myself and to reiterate one more time, this last section, verse 25 rather, is that one of the reasons this early church Christian community to which he was writing probably did not experience the power of God in their midst is because A, they stopped acting like he was going to do anything. 2, they're holding grudges. And a common belief all through Judaism and some in Greco-Roman sources is that you cannot have sins against a person and hold a grudge, which is also considered a sin, and expect to receive the power of God. You can't do it. Only a community that is free from all that nonsense, expecting the God to do something big, praying for his will to be done, as Jesus does in the so-called garden. It's not a garden in Mark's gospel, but in Gethsemane. Those are the people who have their prayers answered. You notice he doesn't say, if you doubt, you won't get it. Because in Mark's gospel particularly, he does not make what we call miracles contingent upon faith. Sometimes it doesn't happen because they don't have faith, but other times he heals people just whenever he wants to. So it's not clean and cut like that. It's just sometimes it requires the person to believe he has the power of God the Father and to do the great things. But it is not a theological necessity. And I have counseled people who felt awful because they should have prayed. They apparently didn't have enough faith for someone who died of cancer or someone who, they just struggle with that. It must be their fault. And it's just, I find that both very sad and very unfortunate that anyone ever believed that. But I know they believe it because people are taught that. I mean, remember the guy, I believe, help my unbelief. Like, I believe you, but I also doubt because your disciples are just trying to get this daggum demon out, and they couldn't do it. Jesus didn't go, what? Forget you. Now, he did say, if anything's possible, of course, everything's possible to one who believes. And he says, I believe, help my unbelief. That is, I'm still not fully there. Well, if that's the case, Jesus could have said, forget you. This should be 100% confidence all the time, or my powers don't work. But he never says that because that's not true. It's not contingent upon your and I subjective belief system for God to do his work. But it is true that Jesus really, really wanted people to have belief and faith, or faith, trust, all the same Greek word. That's why he says, have faith in God. I do want you to believe. I want you to expect. He is listening. He cares. I'll stop there and pause. What question or comments do you have about it? Right after this, we had a fantastic discussion about whether or not God really listens to prayer and what do you do with free will and so forth. So I really hope you'll listen to part 2. I think you're going to really enjoy it.